everybody. So, first question, always like to start off with a fun one. Would you rather wake up one morning to see 1 million Instagram followers in your account or 100,000 newsletter subscribers on Beehive, of course? And why? Do you want to kick us off, Kaya?
Definitely 100,000 newsletter subscribers.
Okay.
More engaged audience. You actually have a connection with them and their contact info. And I think the 1 million follower mark now is not what it used to be. In 2022, there were 40,000 accounts on TikTok with more than 1 million followers. So it's that follower count is so meaningless now that you really want the engagement.
Yeah, I mean, no surprise. I'm in the same boat. Like with a newsletter, you're leaned in when you're when you click to read what I'm writing about that week. You are there to. It's an active choice. Like you're not just kind of scrolling TikTok for the next silly video. Like I have you for whatever 1,000 words I've written that week, and my audience will click on ad. They will take recommendations from me. It's so much more monetizable. The relationship's so much stronger because I can share more of it within there.
Yeah, I'm probably biased here, but I would also say the 100,000 subscribers. The 1 million followers on TikTok or Instagram sounds great until one of the platforms goes down or has an outage or changes its algorithm. And then suddenly overnight you lose your audience reach and maybe your only revenue stream. Versus with the newsletter, you control your reach, you control the distribution of your content. And I won't say on Beehive, but let's say, for example, you have 100,000 subscribers on MailChimp and MailChimp suddenly goes down. It's very easy for you to export your list, put it to another platform, keep sending, and not miss a beat.
In one word, what does audience ownership mean to you guys and why? So you can expand after that one word. If Kaya, you want to kick us off again.
I would say security. I think I've interviewed hundreds of creators at this point in my career, and even if you have the biggest audience, the most relevance, you're still at the whims mostly of social media because that's where the distribution is. So you have this layer of security, I think, when you have some sort of, whether it's an email list or you're selling something and you have your customer data, that gives you a level of security that can be really hard to find as an independent creator.
Security. Great.
Kai took mine. So I'll say, yeah, exactly. I would probably say relationship, which there's a interesting quote from Reed from Night Media, who's famously Mr. Beast manager. He was talking about more within YouTube's context, but how when they would go to VidCon and see short form creators, no one was showing up to those events. These people who had millions and millions and millions of TikTok followers, because they didn't have actual relationships with their audience. It was just kind of that quick scroll thing. Right. Whereas if you have a newsletter audience or a podcast audience, they do show up to things. They do feel like they're part of your story, and they will run around with you, whether it's on the internet or in real life.
Yeah, interesting. Preeya?
Yeah, I'd say control. With audience ownership, you have full control over the sharing and distribution of your content. You're not at the whim of a third-party software that makes those decisions for you, but you rather are in full control.
I love that. And so, Jack, I'm curious from your end as a content creator, what trends are we seeing currently, or you're recognizing as a creator that we're even having this conversation around audience ownership? Because I don't know if it was really discussed couple years back, but now it's becoming a really big topic of discussion, especially with TikTok, ban potentially, and all that stuff. So I'm curious what you're seeing as a creator or what you're thinking about with your own strategy.
Everyone's very scared because of the TikTok legislature, and what's happening there. And I get it. It's it's really easy to say we want to own our audiences. It is harder to do than we realize a lot of the time. But if we're reliant on algorithms all the time, we don't feel like we have control of our own audiences. So if you can build those owned audiences elsewhere, they do have real high value. And that's kind of just the whole conversation right now is how can I have more of my audience? When I do consulting with creators, should I start a newsletter is question number one. Right. And that is a very contextual question for every creator. Do you like making content that way? What would you write about? Is it different than your existing content or supplementary to it? So there's a lot of questions in that field right now. And it's going to be very personal to everyone whether you should be in that space or not.
And Kaya, you report on this whole industry, so I'm curious what you have been reporting on or recognizing in terms of why, again, audience ownership is such a prominent topic of conversation.
Yeah, I mean, Preeya touched on this too, but social apps change their algorithms all the time. If you think about what YouTube was a few years ago versus now, I mean, they're having an identity crisis with whether we want to do short form or long form. Short form isn't monetizing as well, but that's where the audience is. So now if you're a long form YouTuber, you're now having to do shorts. You're having to keep up with all the changes.
Right.
Instagram now changing its algorithm to try to help emerging creators, which can come at the detriment of bigger creators who have been doing that for 10 years on Instagram. So there's that. You mentioned TikTok. That's a potential on the horizon. And then you have AI as well, which is a whole new world where we're going to see content go way up. I don't know if the quality is actually going to go way up, but there's going to be more content that you have to compete with and people using those tools. So it's just changing so quickly that I think it's so saturated. TikTok especially, ushered in a whole new generation of creators and made it so easy to be a creator, but that just means more competition, more noise, and more things you have to do to stand out.
Exactly. And Preeya, you guys are having conversations with content creators. You've been doing a really great job with this talent strategy, and I believe you guys just launched a VIP kind of talent or creator collective where you help content creators actually launch their newsletters and perhaps even do some content for them and design for them. So in those conversations, what are you hearing from the creators in terms of perhaps their struggles, or what the team is hearing from those conversations with creators and why a newsletter is something that they may want to lean into, or audience ownership?
Yeah, definitely. So we feel very strongly at Beehive that everyone should have a newsletter. Anyone, any kind of audience should be able to have a newsletter. So whether you have a large following on TikTok or Instagram or YouTube, or you have a course or a community, all those use cases work very well for you to then turn that audience into a newsletter audience. And a lot of creators agree with us, but then the challenge is, well, then how do I actually go ahead and launch a newsletter? And so we've had a lot of creators in the last 6 months reach out to us that want to launch a newsletter but don't know where to begin or how to begin. And so like Brett mentioned earlier this week, we actually launched the Creator Accelerator program to help with that. And we're doing all the heavy lifting for them. Everything from account creation to onboarding, template design, website design, helping with writing. So hiring them a ghostwriter if they want one, helping them with writing strategy, helping them with audience growth, so paid growth, social growth, organic growth, ad sponsorships, literally everything to go from 0 to 100, because we know the importance of owning your audience and having a newsletter, but we also know it can be very daunting if you're not already in the newsletter space. So hopefully this program makes it a little bit easier for creators.
I love that. And so audience ownership, what comes to my mind immediately, right, is newsletters. But what are the other methods for people in the audience for audience ownership? Like, what are we looking at there? Jack, if you want to chime in on that one.
I mean, I think podcast is the one people think of a lot of the time, which even that's evolved because so many podcasts are YouTube native now, where you are getting algorithmic benefit while making podcast style content. I'll say one of the ones that is newer to me is course creation, which we think of that as like a product. Like I've worked with like the Teachable team. I was at their collective conference not long ago. They're amazing. They're all wonderful. And if you do an information-based type of content, you should definitely like look into courses. I don't have one, and I'm immediately trying to figure that out. We think of that as a product, but those are purchasing customers. That is now like the most qualified follower you have, who will follow you around to other pieces of content, who will then buy other things for you. Like that in itself is a community. And a lot of those products, you can have community elements within them. Is it private Slack groups or Discords or Telegrams or whatever that might be?
Right. And Kaya, what are you seeing on that front as well? I know you've done a lot of reporting around these other community type of companies.
Yeah.
What's on that front?
I would add to, selling something or offering something to download for free is another way. I mean, names are important, email addresses are important, but so is location. Where are they? If you ever want to do a tour or an in-person event, you can get an idea of where are your audience located, right? Like does it make sense for you to go to Dallas and do a meetup if that's not where? So I think that those data points are also important in terms of on top of email addresses. But selling something, I mean, like a paying customer is probably the best, the holy grail. So either selling something digital, whether it's an online course, selling a product, even if it's limited edition, limited merch, or selling some sort of guide. If you're like a real estate creator, selling some sort of home buying guide that people can download, and then you can capture data that way as well.
Yeah, I would say, I should mention this earlier. So I kind of for fun, I always try to have like one project that is for like business, but it's like something very accessible to kind of help the world. And a lot of people didn't know how to make their first LinkedIn post if they worked in like marketing or whatever field and want to get more out there. So I built this little product called Break an Egg, where it's $5 a month, and it shows you, like, gives you like 30 LinkedIn prompts to help you learn how to write about yourself and get your first posts out there. I thought that was like a digital product subscription service. And what it actually turned out to be was like, I was like, and you get this LinkedIn group. The number of people who I meet in real life are like, oh my God, I'm part of Break an Egg. I get so much value out of that. And then I have personal relationships with them when like it started because they were a paying customer of mine. I would have never anticipated that. I thought it was just a way to like kind of give back and maybe have like a little side income. People want that type of community.
Right. That's so interesting. And Preeya, on question on the newsletter front, we capture email addresses, but that's not like the only form of audience ownership or that first party data that they call it. What are other elements that you're seeing creators are capturing from their audiences to truly like own them, especially now on the social platforms and with new iOS updates? It's really tough to like know your demographic or who's engaging with you. So what type of other information should creators perhaps be capturing, and how is Beehive facilitating that in any way?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's a combination of the explicit and implicit data points that you can get from your audience, and then use all of that as you create content. So on the explicit data side, there's, I think, two ways that come to mind, both that you can do natively in Beehive. So one is being able to run an audience poll. You can really easily embed a poll into any one of your newsletters, and you can ask your audience, what did you think of today's email on a scale of 0 to 5? Or moving forward, what kind of content do you want to see more of? Sports, fitness, nutrition. People can answer those questions, and then you can use that information to figure out what sort of content you should be writing about in the future. And then also creating survey forms. So asking your readers a bunch of questions, things like, what's your first name? What's your title? Where do you work? Do you have any kids? Do you have any pets? And then again, using all that information to figure out how often should you send? What sort of content should you send? What sorts of brand sponsorship should you include in your newsletters? I think the most effective newsletters are the ones that cater to their audience the most. And the best way to do that is to know your audience as well as possible. Yep. That's all on the explicit data side. And then implicit data, I think newsletters also lend themselves really well to be able to get a lot of information from your readers. So like, who's opening up your emails? What links are they clicking on? How often are they clicking on their links? Where are they located? I think even those like simple signs of engagement can provide you a lot of information and intel into your audience.
Now, there's been a lot of talk about like SMS and text as another medium, and like that's like a precious piece of real estate, I feel like. I know, of course, a lot of companies, they always ask, like, what's your number? You got 15% off and all that stuff. What trends are we seeing, if any, with SMS and text? Kai, I'm curious if you're seeing growth with that.
I mean, we've seen some stops and starts with it. Like, Community is a platform that's been around for a while. They raised around, I think, 2 years ago now. President Biden is using it. So, and they have other creators. There's other competitors as well. As you said, like it feels invasive a little bit for now. I think our email inboxes, like, we're more open to kind of getting information. But I think for creators who have these really rabid fan bases and they can offer something unique through texting. Like Nicki Minaj is one that has a huge fan base, and I talked to someone who is a big fan of hers and is like, I don't mind getting texts from her because it's like about upcoming shows or about different things. So I think people have to tread lightly, but it's coming. I mean, we're in an election cycle, and I've been getting a ton of political texts, so I think that's going to increasingly.
You got to just text stop in all caps.
I try.
Thanks for unsubscribing. Thanks for unsubscribing.
Yeah, I think this is where part of what you have to think about is how often and where does your audience want your content? Like, I generally write marketing case studies that are either like think pieces on new strategies or breakdowns of content. I'm not convinced my audience wants that in their text messages. Like, I just don't think they want that there. So, well, exactly. And I really do think a lot about oversaturating my audience. Like, I'm much more interested in writing the piece that you'll reference 4 months later than I am hitting you constantly over and over again. So, like, I get the value. I think if you have really core audience, or you think about it as like, for my biggest fans, there's probably some value there for almost every type of creator, and that'll be scaled based on what your audience size is. It scares me as a like primary part of my distribution or part of my business.
That's interesting. Any exploration on SMS and text from a newsletter platform? I mean, is that something that's like, is it a competitor or like a collaborator with email and newsletters?
Yeah, I mean, never say never. We haven't explored text yet. We might in the future. I'm not convinced that it's like the next channel by any means. I think it works really well for some use cases, like the more like marketing, promotional, mass messaging, things like sales or discounts or even like political messages. I think it doesn't do as well with like the one-to-one type of communication. One, just logistically, like within a newsletter, you have a lot more real estate. You can link out to different websites, your own website. You can have, ads, all that kind of thing. You can't do any of that within text messages. So I think it loses a lot of its value there. And I also just don't think it's like the right form of communication. It's hard to explain why, but if I saw a newsletter in my inbox, that's something that I expect to see there. It's something I'm going to engage with. Versus in my SMS inbox, it feels almost like intrusive, like it shouldn't be there. So that could change in the future. I don't know, but I'm not convinced it's the next big thing.
Yeah, no, keep an eye on that. Because I always think like a strategy for YouTubers or even when I was building my own newsletter a couple years ago was like, would it make sense to capture phone numbers and then message them and be like, hey, new newsletter's out, like click here to go view it. I guess it does feel like, why are you in my text? Like,
well, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah.
Like, and I think value prop there is really important. It's like, if I'm going to be in your text, I better have a really good reason why I'm there.
100%. Do you feel the same way with a newsletter? Like, if you have a newsletter.
I mean, we want to do the value prop conversation with newsletters. Like, I think that is the most important thing. Like, if you're making content for the first time, or even if you start to build an audience there, you can kind of back into who you are and niche down naturally. Like, and kind of the dopamine hits cause that. Like, I'm making TikToks, a certain type of content starts to get likes and engagement and views. I naturally make more of that content. And at some point, 6 months later, I realize I'm a TikToker who does this with this type of content. Newsletters, like, you have to elect into a newsletter. So like the masthead of my newsletter is vitally important for me to convince you to subscribe to me. And I think that's a piece of like marketing thinking that if you're a creator going to newsletters, you really have to consider is like have an incredibly strong why I am going to subscribe to this newsletter.
Okay, my final question on this audience ownership side, mailing addresses, like physical mailing addresses. I've seen companies pop up that like allow you to connect with your audience or customers from like a physical mail standpoint. I'm curious if that may be making a return or that still feels kind of like, like also very invasive when you get something in the mail. You're like, whoa, where did you get this from?
I think the location data is most valuable for you to understand where people are. I think if done well and sparingly, it could be good, but you'd have to be careful about it. Like if you wanted to send your audience something, but I don't know. I don't know if I've seen like a great example of that.
I want to lean, of course, into newsletters more now as we kind of went through those methods. Jack, you are a creator who has large Twitter, LinkedIn, all those followings. And there's probably a ton of folks in here who do also have very strong followings on platforms. What do you think are effective strategies from converting an audience from their rented land, right, on social platforms to the owned land, like a newsletter, and capturing that data, that ownership from those audiences?
I don't think there's like a foolproof anything for this. Like, I think it's continually trying to show like the value you will bring there. And it's tough. Like, I am trying to build audiences across primarily 3 places: Twitter, LinkedIn, and the newsletter. And fundamentally, if I'm promoting the newsletter in an organic social post, like the engagement will be lower there. And it's not because the algorithms don't like links, it's because the links are distracting to other types of engagement. So like I've tried a bunch of different things. Like my most successful one day ever of driving subscribers was maybe like a year ago when Stripe, Lyft, and I forget who else all had layoffs in the same week. My newsletter is about social media strategy. So I put up a LinkedIn post and a tweet and it was like, hey, it's usually about brand social strategy, but like we all have personal brands and we all like need to figure out how to get ourselves out there. So like as a one-off, I'm doing an essay that's just about personal branding for professionals. Those 2 posts drove 1,000 subscribers for my newsletter. And it's because I showed them like what I was going to bring to them. And it was very personal to those people. So it really is about finding your personal comfort level with how much you will promote. And we see this with, I mean, it's also rented land, but we see this with TikTokers trying to drive YouTube audiences. I've definitely seen TikTokers where I really like their native, but then they started cutting their native content shorter and it became like I go to my YouTube, but then they weren't complete stories. So there's a push and pull of it. Like I will say one of the other tricks that I use a lot is I will actually republish my full newsletters. Like most of my newsletters are evergreen. I will republish them as LinkedIn posts and just cut them down by like 300 words or so. And like maybe like 3 weeks, 4 weeks after I do it, and include the good old like, this is from my newsletter, here's where you can read that kind of stuff. So because I'm written, LinkedIn and Twitter have like some options there for me.
And Preeya, anything that you're seeing from creators in terms of when they're like, well, I have a great YouTube following, right? Because you work with some YouTubers, and how do they, get people to then subscribe to their newsletter? What effective strategies are there?
Yeah, so actually we talk about this a lot with our creators. Like I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of creators that have large followings on other platforms and want to kind of turn that into a newsletter following. But how do you actually do that? So our recommendation is once they have the newsletter ready to go, once they have like the branding done, the sign-up page, everything ready, they don't actually launch for a few weeks, but they tease that launch on social media. So post like the link to the sign-up page on their stories once in a while. Maybe do like an Instagram live or an AMA where they can talk a bit about their newsletter and get people to start signing up. So by the time they actually launch, a few weeks later, they already have, let's say, like, a few thousand or tens of thousands subscribers to their newsletter. And then keep kind of playing like both platforms side by side. So in every one of your newsletters, you have the handles to your social links at the bottom. So you're pushing people that are reading your newsletter to your socials. Vice versa, you keep plugging your newsletter on your social media, add it to your link in bio. A great example of this is Corporate Natalie. If you follow her on Instagram or TikTok, she's hilarious. She posts a lot of content about the workplace, humor, Gen Z. She actually just launched a newsletter on Beehive a few weeks ago. But she did the same thing where she had her newsletter ready to go, but then waited a good 6 weeks to actually launch it so she could create some hype around her newsletter launch. And it worked really well. And now she plays both channels side by side to facilitate that cross-pollination. I think what also works really well is like providing value in your newsletter that your followers aren't going to get from your Instagram. If it's the same content on both channels, you probably don't have a lot of reasons for your followers to find you on both platforms. So changing like your messaging or what you're providing them. So Corporate Natalie, her videos are very like, short form content, funny, like a lot of zingers, Gen Z humor. But then her newsletter talks more about like, how to style and dress for the workplace, how to stay like physically and mentally healthy while you're working crazy hours. So still around like the workplace side of things, but a different angle. So just like, finding different ways to provide value to her readers.
Right, there has to be like that value prop alignment where it's like I talk about work stuff on my TikTok and Instagram, and then you're not going to go ahead and launch like a fashion newsletter and expect that audience is going to convert. There needs to be that alignment there, and perhaps the newsletter is what allows you to go deeper. So it's like you want more of this stuff, but like on a deeper level or a more professional level, the newsletter is the avenue for that, which is super interesting. Kaya.
I would add too on the complementing the content. I think that's something that video native creators are sort of intimidated by the writing process. But for example, I think, so Emily Mariko, after she went viral on TikTok for the salmon rice, she started a newsletter with meal prep, which I thought was really smart because, yeah, you can try her viral salmon and she still does those videos, but it's like, this is what I'm cooking for the week. These are the ingredients. And I thought that was a really smart kind of way where like she doesn't have to write an essay now, but she is providing something that's valuable. She's getting newsletter subscribers in the meantime. And two, there's little things that like LinkedIn has launched, you can add like subscribe to my newsletter that appears below your name. Like there's little ways like that can help you promote it in a way that's more like passive.
Super interesting. Now suppose you have no following, right? You have no following and you're launching a newsletter. Like how do you grow? Like I feel like that is such a barrier where it's like I don't like I'm starting from zero. How am I supposed to get my first few subscribers that aren't just like my mom and dad or like my best friend? And it's like that's great. That's usually all you need. But like, what can people in the audience actually do when they're getting started to build up an audience?
It's really hard, but like start with friends and family. Like word of mouth is real, and I think if you have an idea and you can be consistent with it, because I think that's the other piece. I was talking to Polina Pompliano, and she used to be a reporter at Fortune, and now she writes a newsletter called The Profile, and she does really interesting pieces on like people you've never heard of, but who have had really interesting careers, whether they were in the CIA or somewhere else. And I'm like, what's your advice to people who want to start a newsletter? And she's like, don't, because most people won't be consistent with it. So you have to kind of decide, like, maybe it's a once a month newsletter, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is still a lot of work. I think you have to commit to some sort of cadence, and like corporate Natalie, maybe you pre-write a few and have like 4 ready to go with your launch. So I think that's the biggest thing, is like you have to be consistent, you have to have a good idea, and then you have to start from somewhere.
Yeah.
So
0 to 1 is
get all
always-
your friends and family, post on social.
Love that.
In a weird way, this is going to sound crazy, there is a slight advantage to it in that a lot of newsletters I think will struggle in the next 5 years because they're supplementary to other things instead of like fully baked pieces of content and product. So like if you are starting with newsletter, like don't get me wrong, growth will be harder. You will probably have to spend some money, but I can totally imagine someone who's like, that is how they think of their primary content platform, building much more valuable content. Because I like I said, I see a lot of newsletters that are based on like the Morning View, Morning View's an Incubus album, not Morning Brew. It's built on the Morning Brew value prop of like, get smarter in 5 minutes kind of thing. That's like a wildly saturated space.
Right.
Whereas like if you're starting your own newsletter and like hopefully focused on what you want to write, something that's a little more long form, it will be more baked, I bet.
Yeah, it's interesting. Preeya, I mean, I'm just plugging Beehive because you guys have a lot of great tools, but I'm genuinely curious, like, what does the platform offer that makes this like 0 to 1 easier? Because again, not many people have following. So if I go join Beehive, am I just going to be in the same situation where growth is really tough, or are you making that easier?
Yeah, I mean, everyone starts with 0 subscribers, right? Like literally everyone. Morning Brew started with 0. Jack started with 0. So don't let that stop you. Let that motivate you, actually. So, start with friends and family, start with word of mouth. I wouldn't downplay like how important it is to have that base to start from. And then like Brett mentioned, there are a lot of tools within the Beehive platform that you can use to grow your audience. So for example, we have what we call the recommendation engine that you can use to cross-promote with other newsletters on Beehive. So when someone signs up for your newsletter, you can show them a modal that says, hey, you might also be interested in one of these 5 newsletters. People can sign up for those. And then vice versa, those newsletters can promote you. So now suddenly you have all the thousands of newsletters that are on Beehive also promoting you. And all those effects just compound very quickly. So for every new user you're bringing on, they're bringing on more and more people.
Yep.
Using things like a referral program. Again, sounds very simple, but once you build a referral program, you include it in every single one of your emails, and now all of your readers are also recommending you to their friends and their family. And so I think you'd be surprised at how quickly you can go from 0 to 1,000 by just using a few of those built-in tools in Beehive.
Yeah, and what Jack, you pointed on earlier about how like you share what you wrote in your newsletter. You're like, this is what I write in my newsletter. Like you can do that on your social platforms. Also, like LinkedIn has like a really great content promotion algorithm in a sense. And so if you get a couple people to like it, it blasts to them. So I guess if you do publish your first few editions, like sharing them, being your biggest supporter. I mean, the creator economy is all about like self-promotion, and you got to shamelessly do it, and that will help things gain traction. So I think that's another great added point.
Well, I just want to stress, like, make really amazing content. Like that is always going to be the most important thing. Like I drive some of the Beehive team nuts because I don't use the feature. Like I need to be using more of the features, and I'd probably have a much larger newsletter if I did. But I spend so much time like beating myself over the head with like, is this the highest value content I can possibly provide you? And the biggest driver of my newsletter growth is people sharing my newsletter and encouraging other people to subscribe. Like I've grown 40,000 in the last year. I've never spent a dime, and I have almost nothing optimized. Yeah. But like I'm just like, am I providing value? And that's the number one thing you got to do, because then when you turn on all of those features, like then you're just pouring gas on the fire.
So, Kaya, you were talking about like the cadence and consistency. Part of audience ownership is also like owning your audience's time. What does that look like? So, when I'm thinking back to like earlier Instagram, like if you were to double post back in the day, it was like, what are you doing? Like you're double posting. So now with all these For You feeds, there really isn't much of that. If you post, something gets seen more.
You have to post like 8 times.
They encourage you better post 10 times a day.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like newsletters or maybe even is SMS, like what is considered, that maybe non so intrusive amount of connection and time that you're taking from your audience?
I mean, it depends on your niche. I think for us, like my newsletter is 3 days a week, and it's a habit for people. They read it. It's something they look at every day. Even if they don't read the full top, they'll skim the bottom, and they always find something kind of interesting from it. So, but mine's very much a news, like what's happening in the creator economy. Here's my analysis. Here's, an interesting profile of a creator. But for other people, once a week, once a month, you have to kind of decide your niche and also the timing of it. Like we mentioned this earlier. I mean, some creators do their newsletter on Saturday because it's more of like a lifestyle, fun read that someone is probably going to read on the weekend. So it all really depends on like what your niche is. I think if you're going to do a newsletter every day, it probably has to be like a news type thing, because otherwise, one, you get really burnt out. You want the quality to be really high. And people also have limited time. So it really depends on kind of what your niche is.
Yeah, I mean, so I publish weekly, and it's usually like 800 to 1,000 words with then a couple links at the bottom. I'm supposed to publish on Wednesdays around 9. That changes a lot depending on if I remember to hit schedule. But I've also done things where, like, just as experiments, like I did a couple weeks ago, I did a Wednesday and a Thursday, which I never do 2 in the same week. I was like, I wonder what happens in the open rate. I wonder if people will read this. Like, I wonder if I publish on a Tuesday instead of a Wednesday. At least with my audience, I've seen almost no change, depending on, as long as I get them sometime in the morning on like a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And like, candidly, the reason I did 2 that week was, one, I had too many espresso martinis and was wired at night and had an idea to write about. And then I also had a Beehive ad network ad. I was like, well, this expires tomorrow. Like, let's do this anyway. And like, for 3 hours of writing, I made $1,200 from 3 clicks. So like, okay, we'll just do that every once in a while too.
It's amazing. What are we seeing in terms of cadence? Are people on Beehive or just newsletters in general beyond sending once, twice, 3 times a week? Like, what's that look like?
Yeah, I think I'll just echo what Kaya said. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer for how often you should send. I think the 2 most important things are consistency and driving value. So counterpoint to what Jack just said, but I do think that the average reader gets used to seeing an email in their inbox on a certain day of the week at a certain time. I think it's important to maintain that consistency. So if you can only send an email once a month, do only once a month. If you can commit to once a week, do once a week. But once you find a cadence or a rhythm that works for you, make sure you stick to it because your readers do get accustomed to it. And then also provide value, right? Like if you can actually provide value with the daily newsletter, by all means, go forward and do it. But don't just write for the sake of writing or force it, because I think your audience will figure that out very quickly and also churn very quickly. But if they are consistently seeing value from a daily newsletter, they will engage and they will read. So it's different for every writer and every reader. You have to just find what's right for you.
I want to talk quickly about money, because that's always very important in the creator economy. Who likes money here? Okay, nice, a lot of hands. So on the platforms, sometimes they're getting paid through their either very shitty curator fund programs, or you make money through like revenue share. What is it about newsletters that makes it a very attractive means for monetizing and going even deeper with your audience, Kaya?
We have some options. You can go the paid route, so you can do maybe 1 free post a month to kind of encourage subscribers and then make it paid and people pay you monthly. You can do advertising as well. I think what's interesting and what I've heard from more of these kind of video-focused creators is that it's a way for them to supplement sponsorship income, where maybe like a video post, the rates are much higher, but for the newsletter, it might be a different rate where it can bring in new advertisers or advertisers who can't afford, the other rate. And there's different ways you can kind of integrate it. And when people are reading, they're much more engaged. So if there is an ad break, they're more likely to read it and click. So I think those are kind of the 2 big things.
Yeah, I mean, so context for how my business works. Like, all of my content is free. My newsletter is very much my primary content format now. And that has the typical ads that, like, I traditionally sell my own ads. I use the Beehive ad network to place inventory I have open. But I prefer to sell my own ads a lot of the time just because of the value I can get out of that. With like my LinkedIn audience, I can do a sponsored post between let's say somewhere between $1,000 and $3,000, let's say, pretty consistently. For the newsletter, like, I built this branded essay, so it's a branded piece of I did one with a social media measurement platform where they showed me their tool. I was like, oh, this 20% theory you have is really interesting. I could write a whole essay about this. And my audience doesn't care if something's branded. I disclose hey, these guys called me, and I actually will talk about the meeting I had with them a lot in my disclosure. That was a $12,000 piece of content. And I can sell that once or twice a month fairly consistently. While building high-value content that still becomes shared within the social media manager community, because it is providing value. So, I can actually get paid to write about things I want to write about, versus trying to insert sponsorships into social media posts.
What about going deeper with your audience in terms of monetizing your other things? Like you mentioned, Teachable courses, or maybe there's a guide that you have. Is the newsletter a strong medium for that type of promotion and going deeper?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, this is where, like I said, I've been so focused on how can I provide you so much value within the newsletter that I haven't pulled the triggers on anything else. And like the very first thing I'm going to be doing for like a new product will be a course like with Teachable to help class back. Was it Mark? Yes, it was. But because like my audience, they do read me to learn about things, and they will just view that as like another thing that they can learn from. And I will end up having like both accessible and like more premium products there. But like, I really do think if you're doing educational based content, it just makes so much sense to try to monetize that way.
Amazing. Preeya, anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to say that, newsletters are prime real estate. Readers are proactively asking for newsletter content. They're reading it in their inbox versus like social media. You're kind of mindlessly scrolling. So you might see ads, but you're not really asking for that content in the same way you are for newsletters. I think that's one reason why newsletters are so valuable. I think the second is that all the readers for individual newsletters almost become like micro communities in themselves. So if you're reading a tech newsletter, you probably work in tech. If you're reading a sports newsletter, you're probably a male in your 20s or 30s. And brands are very desperate to get into newsletters because they know all this information. They know how valuable these readers are. And so Jack mentioned it briefly, but at Beehive, we have what we call the ad network. We provide sponsorship opportunities to anyone who's sending on Beehive. So if you're sending a tech newsletter on Beehive, we can send you brand sponsorships, but tech companies like HubSpot, for example, you can drop it into your newsletter, and you can monetize with these placements. So you have to do zero work, zero effort. You don't have to do any kind of sales outreach of your own. We do all of that for you and provide you with these brand sponsorship deals. And it works really well because publishers want to make money. They want access to these ad sponsorships. And brands are also very desperate for these audiences, so it solves a problem on both sides.
Nice.
And I will double down on like how easy it is to use their ad network. Like, I enjoy the sales process, so I go out there and recruit a lot of my own sponsors. But like with the open inventory, like my ops manager Tara's in the audience. Like we have like a morning call after the Beehive. Tara's amazing. Go meet her. She runs operations for creators if you're looking for help. We'll end up having like a call in the morning where it's like, what do we make off the Beehive ad last night? We're like, oh wow, how do we go like talk to them more? How do we place more of that kind of stuff? And like, it is literally like a 4-click process to place that ad.
That's great. I love that. These are organic plug, by the way, people. All right. It's great. Yeah, there you go. You do pay Jack. All right, final question on my end, and we'll open up for Q&A. This is a prediction one. If you could predict one unconventional method for audience ownership that might take off in the coming years, what do you think it would be?
I know, I'm like, oh. I sort of think we're going to see a return to like personal websites and blogs. So a little bit different than newsletters, but I think one area that creators have not leaned into too much is SEO, like you mentioned too. The creators who have hung on to their websites and blogs, whether it was like a travel blog from 10 years ago, they're like, I still get traffic from it. So I think we're going to see more websites and blogs.
Super interesting.
I think we could see events become more regular.
Right here.
My old boss at Morning Brew, Jacob Donnelly, he runs a newsletter called A Media Operator, which is like the most niched down newsletter possible. It's for people who run media companies. But a big part of his business are both micro and larger conferences that he's running, and like that will probably be his primary income stream alongside that newsletter. I think there's a lot of opportunities for that type of stuff. Like I met a creator 2 years ago. She runs a celebrity gossip podcast. So then she threw a celebrity gossip trivia night at a bar that I attended, and I was totally useless for. But I watched a group of 50.
Was that where you have the espresso martinis? Or?
It was. Where haven't I had the espresso martini? But she probably had 50 people in the audience who paid $40 a piece and all had a great time. And all felt like they built more relation. They were excited to give her money to build more relationship with her, and would definitely come back to the next one.
Love that.
Yeah, I think I have a very boring answer for this one, but I think the reality is that good content is always going to win, and it's like the best way to drive audience engagement. I think a lot of people get caught up in this vanity metric of like, how big is my audience? The same way 5 years ago, people were so particular about their Instagram or their TikTok following. They cared so much about their follower count, and now that's less important. I think same with newsletters. People are, relying upon AI or all these like flashy tools or kind of like gimmicky tactics to grow their list. And in the end, it's like if you have good content, people will read it, people will share it, and you will succeed. So I think we'll see this we've seen this massive explosion of people launching newsletters. That's great. I think that should continue and will continue. But I think things will kind of stabilize where people will begin to prioritize really good content over everything else.
Amazing answers. Well, Kaya, Jack, Preeya, thank you so much for answering my questions. Let's give a round of applause for these wonderful panelists. Great stuff.